Hey folks, so today I want to start a series on the emitter engine within Fusion. What we're going to be focusing on is mostly a single node in today's tutorial, but there's a whole bunch more nodes that go along with it. And the most important node is the emitter node, and we're going to be looking at that now. So what the emitter node really is where all these little particles will essentially come from. And then we can use all these other fancy nodes that we're not going to be talking about today to do some really cool stuff with these particles that come out of the emitter node. So before we get rolling, I'm just going to head back into the cut page here. So up here I have this PNG file. It's a pretty small file, 64 by 64 pixels. And we're going to be using this to help demonstrate our particle system. So what I have right now is I have a Fusion composition down at the bottom. We're just going to go into this here. We're going to go into the Fusion page. And what I'm going to do is open up our node editor. And I'm going to kind of start from scratch. I'm just going to delete these. We're going to rebuild this pretty quickly. So what we have essentially is just our media out. So this is what we would have at the start of a fresh Fusion composition. So if I right click here in the node editor and I come down to add tools and under particles, I see all these options here. A lot of options, and I think each of these really deserves a tutorial on their own. So I'm going to focus right now on just the pEmitter as I was mentioning earlier. So this is the emitter node called pEmitter, particle emitter. I'm also going to bring down a pRender node. I'm not going to talk about this too much today, but it is necessary if we want to see the effect of the emitter. So the media out is capable of displaying stills and it's capable of displaying clips and all that type of stuff. It cannot take an emitter node as an input. It needs this render node that sits in the middle that allows the media out to understand what the emitter node is doing. So when we hook up a very simple chain like this, we'll get the defaults that we see above here. So we're going to click on the emitter node, we're going to come up here to our inspector, and we're going to focus on all the things that we see here. So what I'm going to do to give us some more real estate, I'm just going to close down my node tree, so we got a lot of space to check things out over here. So just at a very high level, the idea here, and really spending this entire tutorial just on this emitter node, is so we have a good fundamental understanding of how the source of all these particles works. So then when we start to understand this whole particle system that Fusion has to offer, we can start to generate our own effects because we understand how everything sort of links together. So that's really the idea here. So I see I have my render node selected here, so I got to go back into the node tree and select the emitter node. That's what we want to focus on. Now we see everything come up here for the emitter node. Close down the node tree, close down this media pool, and let's rock and roll. So just to go quickly through all the icons up here. So the first one here is our main emitter controls. We're going to go through all these in a little bit. We also have the sets icon here. Finally, we have a style, and we have region. So I'm going to start off actually with the style and the region. And first of all, I want to make a distinction between what's the difference between a style and a region. So a region essentially is this red circle in this case. It's the region in which these particles are going to be emitted from. And underneath this region button here, we can go through a whole bunch of options where we can change what this region looks like. And we're going to go into that. The style is when you look at each individual particle, it's what that individual particle looks like. So we can change the color of that, we can change the shape of that, we can change its velocity, we can do a whole bunch of things to each of those individual particles, and that will be handled under the style button. So a good place to start, I think, is all these different options for different regions. So our default here we see is a sphere, and of course we can control the size of that. What I'm going to do right now is I'm just going to come down to my playhead. I'm going to move this back to 0, and I'm just going to push play, and off we go. So nothing too exciting right now. We don't have any motion. We don't have any effects on any of these particles, but this is the basis of our particle system. So each of these particles here, I'm just going to head over to style for a minute. Let's put region on hold, and we'll head over to style. Each of these particles are defined right now as a point. So we see here our region drop down. So our default here is sphere. I'm not going to go through these in order. I'm going to go through these in sort of what I would consider a logical fashion. We can set rectangle as well. That sets up this rectangle. That gives us a width and a height. So I can take this width and I can go up to 1, which is the sort of full dimension. And I can drag that up to the top, and you can sort of once we put some motion on these particles, you can kind of imagine falling rain or something like that, right? So we can use this rectangle. We can also use what's called a mesh. Now a mesh, we're gonna skip over this for the purpose of this tutorial, because this tutorial I want to focus on 2D the 2D aspect of the particle system. There's also a 3D aspect of things, and a mesh is essentially a 3D object that we can feed in to define our region. So picture something like a cloud or something that has a volume. A mesh will have a volume, and you can set up the particles to be emitted from either just the surface of that volume. So let me just choose mesh. I said I wasn't going to get into it, but we're not going to get too far into it. The region type we can set to a volume, or we can set to a surface. So if you picture something like some three-dimensional shape, like let's use the cloud as an example, we could set up our particle system so that the particles are being emitted from within that entire volume. But we're not going to get into that in too much detail. There is one other 3D object here, which is a cube, so we're going to skip over that one as well. So we did sphere, we did rectangle, we looked at mesh. We can also have a line. When you pick line, it kind of just shows up as a point. So you got to grab, there's actually two of these little handles on top of each other. Just grab one and drag it over this way. And you can see here that all these particles are being emitted along this line. Looks a little weird now because, again, there's no motion on these particles, so they're all just sort of staying there on the line. But that's one other region that we can use. We talked about cube. I'm going to come back to bitmap in just 1 second, and let's actually go to all first. All just means entire screen, essentially. So we can also set up a Bezier curve. So when I click on Bezier, up over here you see all the Bezier draw options, and I'm just going to grab my mouse. I'm just going to click and drag some random weird looking shape on the screen, and I'm going to close it off by joining to that final point. And now I've defined that region there. So I can do whatever I want here. I can select these nodes here. I can smooth them out. I can grab these Bezier handles and I can kind of do whatever I want. So you can get pretty fancy as far as defining a very custom region. Finally, we can come up here to bitmap. Now, before I click on bitmap, I want to bring up, I'm going to stop this animation right now. I'm going to bring back our node editor because I want to point out something very important. So what you see here, let me bring in a fresh emitter node just to sort of prove my point here. Here's the emitter node. I'm just going to drag it in. What you notice with a default emitter node is it has no inputs. All it has is this single output node that we would connect into our render node. Right here, I actually do have an input, and that's a pEmitter mesh input. And that little triangle showed up as soon as I'll use this as an example. I'll click on this emitter node. I'll come over here to region. I will pick mesh and take a look at the left side of things here. There we go. There's that little triangle to input a mesh into this emitter node. The reason that's still there is even when I go back to any other selection, back to sphere or whatever, that little triangle doesn't go away. So I just wanted to point that out. So to keep things less confusing, I'm going to delete that. I'm going to start with a new emitter node, hook things up. There we go. So there's no inputs right now. So what we just saw is when we select a mesh, we can have a little triangle input show up. Also, when we select a bitmap, we have another one of these triangles show up. And we can tell by hovering over, the text says this one here is emitter.region and then bitmap, whereas the other one said mesh. So this is where we're going to feed in an actual bitmap. And that's when we're going to pull in this media pool here. Under stills, I have that icon. I'm going to drag that icon down and it creates a media in. I'm just going to quickly rename that. I'm going to call that arrow because that's that purplish bluish arrow. And I am going to feed the output of arrow into the input of the emitter node, which is the bitmap node. And now what you can see is the region. I'm going to play this here. The region is actually that arrow shape. So this bitmap is actually defining this emitter region, and it's using, if we select the emitter, we're selecting bitmap. We have this field here, which is the region bitmap, pointing to arrow because that's the name of our node over here, our bitmap node. We're set up right now to our alpha channel. I can also pick different channels. So I can pick red, green, and blue, for example. So if I pick red, you'll notice that there was a couple lines on the side that had some red color in it. Those have a value of 0 in the red channel. So we don't see the entire arrow. So take a look. I'm going to switch it back to our alpha channel, and you'll see there's those sides appear again. So if we look down here, we also see this little slider that has a low and a high value. So what this essentially is representing is what alpha values do we want to have the emitter emit particles from. So to explain that a little bit further, what I'm going to do is I'm going to come up here, I'm going to click on this dual viewer mode. I'm going to, you know what, before I do that, what we're going to do is we're going to make these particles a little bit easier to see. And we're going to come over to the style, and now we're set up as a point. What we're going to do is we're going to come over here to Ngon. We're going to go through this in more detail after, but for now I just want to get things set up so we can see things a bit better. I'm going to select this circle over here. I am going to take the size control and I'm just going to crank it up a little bit so we can see things a little bit more clearly. I'm also going to come over to back to the controls node here, and I'm going to increase the number of particles that we have just to sort of fill in things a little bit. So that's good enough for now. So what I want to do then is I'm going to come up here, I'm going to close that viewer down, I'm going to open up our node editor, and I'm going to grab our arrow and I'm going to drag that arrow into our first viewer here over on the left. I'm going to close down my nodes again, and what we're seeing here is our full color representation of our PNG file. First thing I want to do is come up to this control here, and I want to bring this drop down here, and I want to select color inspector, and then I want to turn that on. And what that's going to do is bring up this little guy up here where we can, wherever we're scrolling over our image here, we're going to see the red, green, blue, as well as the alpha values. So the RGB we don't care about too much because our emitter is set up to key off of the alpha channel. So we want to look at these alpha values. And we can look at those alpha values directly by coming up to this selector here and coming down to alpha. So now we see our alpha mask essentially, and now we can start to see how the alpha channel relates to the actual particles that are emitted. So what this white region represents, it's basically saying anywhere this arrow here is white, that is where we can emit particles from. So if you look out into the black space over here, we see our alpha value up here is 0. When we move into the middle of the arrow, we see that alpha value go up to a full 1. But if you kind of look around these edges here, so there's an alpha value of 0.02 and so on and so on. So where we see different edges here, these are effectively different levels of transparency. And that's where, if we go back into our node editor and we select our emitter, come back over here into region, now that's where the slider comes into effect here. So if I bring this value, this top value down from 1, anything that's set up as 1 here will not be emitting particles anymore. So if I bring that down just even the slightest little bit, most of our particle emitter region has kind of disappeared in a sense. And so all these values that show up here have alpha values sort of down in this region that fit in between 0.5 and, in this case, 0.989. So let's take that and move it up a little bit. We can take the lower end and we can bring it right down to 0, and that essentially includes all the black values, so that kind of ignores our alpha mask in a sense. We probably don't want to do that. But we can set things anywhere in between to just pick up particular alpha values that we want to see here. So using this slider, one thing we could also do if we wanted to is we could actually invert our mask essentially here by pulling this back all the way down to 0, and then we can sort of bring this value down a little bit, and you can start to see the inversion of that arrow show up there. So if we were to go back here and increase our number, then we can get a very clear delineation of that sort of inverted alpha mask. Since this is keyframeable, you can get some pretty neat effects just from playing with this little alpha slider here. Alright, so I'm just going to set this back here to default values, so that's 0.5 and 1, and now we're back to our regular alpha mask. I want to point out something quick I kind of alluded to earlier about a potential gotcha that you can run into. If I highlight over this arrow here, this is the emitter input from the arrow bitmap. If you read what it says on the pop-up, it's the emitter.region bitmap. So if I come over to style here, I'm going to change this from Ngon, and I'm going to bring in bitmap here. What I can do, or what you notice first here, is a new arrow came up here, and this is pEmitter1.style bitmap. So those are easy to confuse if you're not paying attention, because you have one that's region bitmap and one that's style bitmap. And those correspond to their icons, their style and their region icons up here. So just something to be careful of. So what I can do here is I can take this arrow, I can also put this into my channel over here, and now I actually see the little arrows as all the little particles. So I have an arrow alpha mask defining the region, but I also have those little arrows showing up as the actual particles. So we're going to go over all these controls in a bit, but what I want to do for now is I just want to set this, I'll keep this at bitmap for now. I'm going to go back into my region and I'm going to change my region to rectangle. Okay, so I've gone back to the region and I've redefined it as a rectangle 0.5, 0.5, just to sort of keep things in the middle of the screen for now. So if we head over here back to controls, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the number and I'm going to keep it at 10 right now. So it's a default to 10, but what happens, or what this number means, is this is the number of particles that's going to be created per frame. So if you look now, we're up at frame 103 or so. So if we go back to our first frame, we have 10 particles that are showing up here. If you're counting, there's a couple that are kind of overlapping over here. What we can also look at is this lifespan here. So this lifespan is set up to 100. So that means 100 frames this particle is going to last for. So what I'm going to do for now, just to help make things a little bit clearer, is I'm going to set this to 1. So that means each frame, these particles are going to die off, and the next frame 10 more are going to be generated. So I can see that by coming down to our timeline, and I'm just going to sort of step through. So there's another 10, there's another 10, and so on and so on and so on. What we can add to that, if we want a little bit of flavor to that, is we can look at this number variance. And this number variance, for example, say we set this to number 2. What that means is this number of particles generated per frame is going to vary from 9 to 11. So it's going to take this value of 2 and it's kind of equally split it below and above the value 10. So from 9 to 11. And just to prove that, we'll go down to, we'll change this number here to 3. So this variance now is going to go from 2 to 4. So if we look at, we go through these frames, 2, 3, so we're never going to see any more than 4 or any less than 2. So our lifespan, again, this is how many frames that the particles are going to last for. We'll keep this at 1 for now. We're going to be cranking this up a little bit later. And then there's also the variance. So again, that's the same variance on the number of frames, and it works in sort of the same fashion as this number variance here. Down here we have color. Use style color. Well, our style is actually set to bitmap. So there's a color associated with it, but really the color is coming from the actual bitmap. So what I'm going to do quickly is I'm just going to go back to this n-gon over here. So now we're back to these dots. Just for fun, I'm going to crank up the number a little bit here. Come back to style, and then we can choose our color there. So the color is coming from this style. There's also another option though. If I go back to the main controls here and I pick use color from region. So I'm going to select that now, and that's turning into white. And we go over here to region, and it's just set to rectangle. There's not really a color associated with this region. However, we can go back to make this bitmap, which was our arrow. Now if you look at this, the color are starting to map to the original colors from our bitmap file. So I'm going to put this number back down to 10, but what I am going to do is increase this lifespan here. So increase this lifespan up to, I don't know, a large number of frames. Then as I scroll through this here, I'm going to be getting more and more of these particles accumulating. And now you can start to see the arrow take shape. So now I can look at this position variance here. Now what that does is that's going to essentially blur the boundary of our region. So take a look as I slide this up here. So we're starting to kind of exceed the boundaries there. So that kind of gives that soft edge of sorts to your whatever your region happens to be. So as a very quick example to show a little bit about this position variance, I've kind of keyframed it. So I've gone back, I've set the number of particles up to 500. I've taken the lifespan, I brought it down just to 5 frames. And what I've done is I've keyframed position variance. So at frame 0, I have a value of 1. And then on my final frame, it comes down to a value of 0. And that value of 0 means there's no variance on my initial region. So what you see over time is all these particles kind of forming into a particular shape by the end of the clip. Okay, so I've reset things and I have a sphere showing up here. And just a quick note, I was mentioning earlier about regions, 3D regions, talking about the cube and the mesh. A sphere is a 3D object as well, but we're going to be just focusing on the 2D nature of it right now. Okay, so let's take a look over here at style. So we're set up to point right now. So what we want to look into is what do these guys down here do. So there's an apply mode, an add, and a merge, and there's this sub-pixel rendered checkbox here as well. So let's dig into what those do. And in order to look at those, what we can do is I'm going to hold down the control key and I'm going to use my mouse scroll wheel to zoom in here. And so when you zoom in on this sort of field of particles here, you can kind of see a bit of a gridded nature show up here, right? Things are kind of They look like they align to a grid perhaps. And of course they do. They align to a grid of pixels. So if we go over to this here to bring up our magnifier, and then I'm going to turn on the magnifier, which you can see there is a number of these particles line up on that grid of pixels. Now you kind of have to ignore the checkerboard pattern in the background and really just look at that screen door grid that you see where all the particles lie. So those are actual pixels, and so those particles sit directly on the pixel grid. Now what I'm going to do very quickly, I'm just going to change the color here just to show what this apply mode does here. So I'm going to go into style, I'm going to go down to color controls. Color controls, I'm going to take these values down, green and blue down to 0, and I'm going to set this to 0.5. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to come back over to here, to the controls, and I'm just going to increase the number a little bit until I see exactly what I want to see here, which is this brighter particle right here. So what that is, that's actually two particles that overlap each other. And when we have, if I go back to the style control, if we have our apply mode set to add, Resolve is going to add up the value of those two particles. So if I take a look down here, this empty space right here is going to fill up when I mouse over something. So I go mouse over one of these particles over here. The red value down in the bottom status bar is 0.5, which corresponds to the value that I've set up over here. If I come over this one here and I look at the red value, its value is 1. So 0.5 plus 0.5 equals 1. So all it's doing is simply adding up each of those channel values. If I come over to this grid here, you can kind of see a whole bunch of the bright particles show up. So if I come over here to apply mode, I change this to merge. Keep your eye on this one here. Merge is just going to, merge those two particles, for this frame anyway, together and treat them as a single particle. So that's what merge does. So let's take a look at this subpixel rendered. Take a look at this particle field here when I click this subpixel render checkbox. Things kind of smear together. And if I come look over here, we look at our magnified grid, and now those particles are not aligned to a specific spot on the pixel grid. They're kind of smeared between pixel grids here. So that's what the subpixel rendered checkbox is doing. It's on each frame, it's smearing each of these particles. So checking this on can give you potentially a more smoother effect as you travel through your timeline. But because of the nature of the computations that's going on behind the scenes, this is a little bit more expensive in terms of the load on your workstation. Alright, so I'm going to uncheck this for the moment, and I'm going to change my style from point down to the bottom here to point cluster. So point and point cluster both share these apply mode and subpixel render checkbox. There's a couple other options here that point cluster takes a look at. So we got way too many particles here to really understand what's going on. So I'm going to just hop over here. I'm going to bring this down to 10 or so. And let's just go back to the first couple frames here so there's not too many particles. Okay, right there we see clusters of particles, and each of these clusters look to be about 5 particles each. We see over here that there's 4, but there's a bright one, so that means we have this overlap going on. So each of these is 5 particles in a cluster, and that number is set up in right here, number of points. We also have this variance for the number of points in a cluster, and that works in the same fashion as the variance options that we looked at previously. So I've reset our region back to our rectangle here, and let's take the style, and now let's take a look at blob here. So what blob is essentially, think of it as a pixel, but you start to have a bit of size control. So I can take the size slider and then I can kind of start to move this up here. Right now my slider is limited to 0.5. I can come in here and I can type 5, for example, if I want, and I get some pretty big blobs. And when you do that, just how these controls generally work, now my slider has been reset. So now it's set to a maximum value of 8. So just something to keep in mind. So what a blob really is essentially just what you see there. It's kind of a blurred circle. I'm going to increase the size just so we can take a look at this. I'm going to increase the size, but I'm going to decrease the number a little bit so that they're a little bit more clear. Okay, there we go. Come back into style, and I have this noise control also. So I can put some noise on these blobs. I'm also, for now, for this video, going to skip velocity and z-scale here because we're starting to talk in different dimensions, and also I'm going to handle all the velocity stuff in a further tutorial. We can, however, look at the size over life here. So what if we want to do, let's take some blobs. You see them do their thing. I'm going to just reduce the size just a little bit here at the start. And what we'll want these blobs to do is perhaps grow over their life. So I'm going to just drag up a node here. And so what you can see, I'll just let that loop, is if we look at a particular blob, we see the size increase up to a point and then sort of decrease to the end of its life. And the X scale here is determined, of course, by its lifespan. I can select nodes here and I can push S key, same thing, same shortcuts that I would use in the spline editor, apply here. And so I can drag these little guys down and I can do whatever I want here. So just by doing that, you can start to get some pretty neat effects there. We can also take a look at a brush style. And so what we can do is we can choose our brush. So we'll just go through a few of these. So here's this metal ball. Some of these are potentially useful. Some are a little bit cheesy. These little fish one. So there's a whole bunch of these defaults. So I'm not sure how many of these you would use. I probably, if I was gonna want to use an image, I would come and use the bitmap. I would have a little more control. But in any case, if you want to check through some of these defaults, there's some ones at the bottom here. These little star ones. Okay, maybe those would be all right. One thing to note is you can see this star here happens to overlap and it's kind of cutting off this star. Well, I can use our alpha. So keep an eye on this region here. If I take our alpha and I bring it down to 0, it starts to blend them all together. So I can use this alpha control to handle that kind of thing. So not sure how useful brush is. Maybe you'll find it useful. Line, this is definitely a cool one. We're going to look at this a lot more when we start to play with velocity and stuff, because this is how you can create kind of a star field effect or something, right? Then we're back here to n-gon. N-gon is what we were looking at before. So an n-gon is an n-sided polygon. So a hexagon would be a 6-gon or a 6-sided polygon. The sides we can define right here. N-gon sides were set to 5 by default. There's a bunch of these n-gon types. Some of them are circles, so they kind of ignored this number of sides. But let's just sort of go through these real quick. I'm going to increase the size of this right here, these here, so we can just see them a bit more clearly. So if I click on this circle, so I sort of get this blurred circle, different effect circles. Here's just your straight old polygon. So this is a solid polygon. And you'll notice the starriness control here. Starriness kind of just pinches these things in or bows them out. So watch what happens when I move this starriness slider. If I set it down to a value of 0, I'm at about 0, I'll just go directly to 0. That means it's just going to have these straight sides. If I go to a negative number, it's going to convex them. If I come to a positive number, it's going to concave them. So then I also have some neat little effects here that I can see. So this is, what's this one called? N-gon star. Different shadings. So shading from the inside out to the outside in, vice versa. And then I just have circles over here. All right, so we're roughly halfway through all the stuff that the pEmitter can do. So I think this is a good place to call it quits for part 1. So we'll be back in a few days. We're going to take a look at all this color controls. We're going to go back into looking at velocity, rotation, spin. We're going to start to introduce the 3D aspect of the particle system. So a lot of good stuff to come. If you made it this far, thank you so much. Much appreciated. And we will talk to you all soon.